The main thing that discerns Muslims from Christians and other groups is the belief in the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Now, how can we know whether the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was actually a prophet sent by God? As there have been many people who have been claiming throughout history to be sent by God or receiving words from God. How can we know that the claim of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was something that is true? Firstly, in order for us to look at anyone and analyze their claim, whether they were a prophet or messenger sent by God, is to see whether they are able to make true prophecies and whether they have a miracle. For example, we know that Moses, he split the sea with God's permission. We know that Jesus, he healed the blind and the leper with God's permission. And we know that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, what exactly was his miracle? His miracle was the Quran, which is a timeless miracle that can be analyzed now, just as it was analyzed in the 7th century. So we have this miracle, which is the Quran. And how exactly do we know that the Quran is a miracle? So firstly, now, in order to know if it's actually a miracle, it's to open it and read it. Now, when we open it and read the Quran, we see that there's a challenge that is proposed by God. God says, if you are in doubt about what we have revealed to our servant, then produce a surah like it. Produce a chapter like it. So God is saying that if you're in doubt, if you don't believe in this book, that it's from God, then produce something like it. It's a challenge. And when we look at the era of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it was an era of poetry, just like the era of Moses was an era of magic, just like the era of Jesus, it was an era of medicine. Now the era of the Prophet, it was of poetry. There were several poets within Arabia. Now when we look at the Quran, no one has ever created something like that of the Quran. No one has created a chapter like it, whether it be in its rhetoric, its linguistics, or in its structure. No one has been able to compete with the Quran on any level. In fact, there's one thing to consider, that the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was illiterate, so he could not read or write. So to say that he created the Quran wouldn't be logical. Hence, this challenge was not fulfilled. And even the poets at the time, there were several poets who tried doing this, they failed miserably when it came to challenging the Quran. And so they would actually claim that the Prophet was a poet. However, he could not have been a poet because he could not read nor could he write. He was an illiterate man. So that is one evidence that we know that the miracle of the Prophet was the Quran. The Quran is timeless and the Quran must have been from God, and you could not have produced something like it. In its linguistic, it was just a miracle. It's a linguistic miracle as well. And another example of this is when we look at Surah Mujadila. This is another example. It's a smaller example. But when we look at the middle of the surah, it says that Satan has taken hold of them and made them forget the remembrance of Allah. And when we go through this chapter, we actually see that every verse has the name of Allah in it. Is this a coincidence? No, not at all. Every verse mentions Allah. And in the middle verse, it says that Satan has made them forget Allah. So essentially, this chapter is actually reminding us of Allah linguistically. It's not directly saying that, but we see that every verse mentions Allah. And this is not something that could be made by a human. Because when we look at the context in which this surah was revealed, it was revealed to a woman who was complaining to the Prophet about her husband. And this revelation was sent to the Prophet in response to that woman in that situation. So we see it could not have been something that was made by a human, and yet it is so precise. Now, that is complete for the miracle part. We know that the Quran was a miracle. What about the prophecies? How can we know that what the Prophet said was true? Well, he made several prophecies. The first prophecy I would like to mention is that the Prophet said that He mentioned that the hour will not come, and he mentioned several things within the hadith. And he said, until you see the barefooted, destitute, naked Arabs competing in the construction of tall buildings. Now, this was not something the Prophet could have known, because it's something that occurred within the last 50 to 100 years. So if we look at major cities today, such as Dubai in the UAE, the tallest tower today is in Dubai. Dubai in the UAE in general, it was founded on oil. It was something that was created upon the founding of oil. And without that, we wouldn't have what we have today. Just 50 to 100 years ago, these Arabs were still living in the deserts. They were not living in these big and tall towers. They were living in small houses. They were living in the deserts, just like how the Prophet is described, destitute. They were living like a destitute society, and they were not advanced at all. And it was only with the emergence of oil that they actually were able to build these tall towers. And in fact, the tallest clock tower is in the Prophet's city itself, Mecca, which shows that this was a true prophecy that the Prophet could not have known within his time. Another prophecy I would like to mention is that the Prophet said that that Arabia would return to its greenery. Now, when we analyze this is not just a prophecy in the future. He's also mentioning something about the past. So he's making a historical, accurate claim that Arabia was green. And this is actually accurate itself, that Arabia was once green and it will return to being green. So he's making a historical claim that it was green, and he is also saying that, so that is another evidence of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Now, all these evidence, they point to the prophethood of the Prophet, peace be upon him, as someone who is claiming to have received revelation from God could not have made such accurate predictions into the future, which could not have been known. And they have actually actualized in today's time. And another is the timeless miracle of the Quran, which cannot be replicated at all. And this is all what I wanted to say within this video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.